Today we have a very special webinar with AWC's Chief Executive Officer, Tim Allard. Before we start, I'll just remind you that you can ask questions for me or Tim using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And don't forget that you can catch up on this webinar or any of the previous episodes that we've done at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy website. That's australianwildlife.org. So thank you to everyone who's tuned in, and Tim, we might get started.
Thanks, Joey. And I just make a note that at AWC, we work across Australia on the land of First Nations people right across Australia and pay our respects to the elders past and present.
Thank you. So we're very lucky that Western Australia opened their borders just to let you out to speak to us today on the East Coast, hoping that you can also make it back across to Western Australia.
Yes, like anything in a good COVID time, there's challenges today that people might appreciate in Sydney. So we'll deal with that hour by hour.
Now, today, I'd like to talk about the challenges that we've all been facing over the past 18 months. And I think last time we spoke, around this time last year, we were still in that recovery phase coming out of last summer's devastating bushfires. Do you want to reflect on the efforts of AWC in that recovery work and where we've got to with some of those bushfire recovery projects now?
Sure. So I think the last 18 months is probably a great example of what AWC is all about and why, to be frank, it's such a privilege to work at AWC and a privilege to work with a team that make AWC operate in the way that we do. And Joey, when we caught up last time, was in the aftermath of the bushfires, and we'd had teams head out to Kangaroo Island to help with the recovery of the Kangaroo Island dunner, then listed as a species most likely to go extinct post bushfires. And working with the Army, the Dogue family, the private landholders, Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife, very quickly building a fenced area to secure the future of that threatened species. From there on, we deployed ecologists to properties through New South Wales and to help those that have been burnt out, and through the Wollombi Valley out from Sydney, on the outskirts of Sydney, working with landholders to help them deal with the aftermath of the impact of the fire. And what people really wanted to know was, what do I do? Where do I go? And again, just that the dedication and the passion of our staff to get out there and help those who needed it was nothing short of inspirational.
Yeah, I think that was obviously a very challenging time, but I think there was also a silver lining in the way that conservation groups pulled together and really galvanised conservation efforts. And I think AWC was a big part of that, offering our resources to various projects around the country.
That's right. And in 2019, we'd actually conducted an internal strategic review. And one of the outcomes was to set a vision statement, being an engaged population that values Australia's biodiversity. And as tragic and traumatic as those bushfires were, one of the outcomes has been a greater awareness of Australia's biodiversity. Yeah, we know we're a global biodiversity hotspot. We're the home for 10% of the Australian of global biodiversity. And as tragic as it was, I think there's now a growing awareness of what's at risk and what we've got and what is so special about what we have in Australia.
Yeah, well, I guess that is a silver lining, but of course it was a double whammy. So we went straight from that bushfire recovery into the coronavirus year 2020. I think, for AWC, it was interesting to see the impacts of the virus and the pandemic and the lockdowns on the way we were able to operate, because we actually still got a lot of our field work done. Do you think that was because of the way AWC is structured or because of our model?
Look, I think it was. We came out of the bushfires and the way we responded and helped those who needed it. And then, as you said, straight into the COVID impact. And everybody on the planet has obviously been dealt a blow by COVID. And we were no different. And we went through a process of identifying what those key risks to AWC were in terms of how we deliver those projects, and particularly those projects where we must have day-to-day attention to work such as the fenced area projects or the fire management programs. And I think partly our model helps that we have 80% of our staff are in the field, so living and working out on sanctuaries. And so when COVID hit and we had to go into lockdowns, we already had people in the field, so they could, by and large, continue to do their work. But what we had to do is shut access to the sanctuaries, but still find a way to make sure we're providing resources such as food and fuel for the vehicles and so on. So we came up with protocols to enable that. We delivered the fire program in the Kimberley, where we had the Dumba-Manyari, Willigan and AWC staff based at Charnley River for, I think, 12 weeks. And again, there's another example of the core fundamentals of AWC at work that we're still able to deliver a fire management program over about 4.3 million hectares, in spite of the impact and the lockdown required by COVID.
Yeah, and I think, we talked about social distancing. I mean, a lot of our remote staff are used to being away from population centres and being quite isolated.
That's right. And again, with all deference to our staff, but a lot of our staff, sanctuary staff, are professional social distancers. That's how they live and work. And I think of Gavin and Kerry at our Pungalina Sanctuary as a classic example. At Pungalina, you go through the wet season, you can spend up to 6 months in isolation. The roads are closed, the airstrip can't be used. So they'd already gone through a wet season when COVID hit. We then had to close the sanctuary to any external access. So they then had to go through another extended period without seeing any other people. So that was a classic example of dedication and their work ethic at play. But also we had to recognise the impact that provides to people and making sure that they were well supported, we were communicating and talking to them on a regular basis. And that applies to all of our sanctuaries. We also had to recognise that a number of our sanctuaries are in close proximity to Indigenous communities. And I think of Cape York, so Piccadilly Plains on Cape York or the Kimberley, where there's particularly tight lockdowns put in place to protect those Indigenous communities. So we really had to think about, one was a continuation of our programs, but also doing it as safely as we possibly could, with respect to our staff and to our partners.
We mentioned, as we were catching up earlier, that a lot of our work does involve travelling across state borders, not just for the humans that work at AWC, but also moving animals across the country in a massive translocation program. Were any of those operations impacted by border closures and quarantine requirements?
Yeah, without a doubt. It was a very difficult period of time for programs. And I think the challenge on translocations is there's a lot of detail, as you can imagine, behind a translocation program, that you can only translocate certain species at certain times of the year that has to coincide with climatic conditions or their breeding cycles or whatever the case may be. So you have to choose and plan the time you do the translocation very carefully. And yeah, we had teams who'd moved from New South Wales to Western Australia to capture, I think it was a red-tailed phascogales. And COVID hit, there was an outbreak, and very quickly we had to think about getting them out of Western Australia and back home to make sure they weren't in lockdown. But despite COVID and despite all those lockdown protocols, we still undertook a number of translocations right across Australia. We're able to figure out protocols to get animals across borders, and in some cases that meant handing boxes across border lines, making sure that staff didn't cross borders. So it was a lot of dedication that went in to make sure that we were still conducting and delivering effective conservation programs.
I think for all of us now, we're learning to live with the pandemic. And so that's now incorporated into planning of all of our field programs. How has that affected the planning process for our work?
That's right. I think, we've talked about it at the AWC board level and within the executive team and right across AWC that although we've come out of 2020 with a significant impact of COVID is really here to stay for a long period of time. We've got a couple of years left in this thing before vaccinations or whatever other mechanisms get put in place. And so we need to think about how do we deal with COVID into the future. And it's continued to be an impact for us this year. We've had certain events we've had to cancel or curtail. We've had to defer and reschedule various things. But in terms of how we consider and manage the impact of COVID, we've put risk assessments in place. So when staff are moving across the landscape, there's a risk protocol that they go through to mitigate and understand those risks. Likewise, when we're conducting activities, to make sure that people are safe in conducting their activities. And
with that, risk protocol, you've actually been caught up in a few quarantine and self-isolation situations. Actually, at Buller River, you were required to isolate for a little while, which I can think of worse places to be stuck.
Yes, it wasn't exactly the most challenging part of the world to have to self-isolate. But for those who don't know, Buller River it's on the Victoria River, so it's about 9 hours from Darwin. And there was an outbreak of COVID. I think it was in Perth at the time. And given I'd just come from Perth to Buller River, I was required to self-isolate while they figured out where to go and get tested, which was a 9-hour drive away. And then recently I transited Melbourne Airport just ahead of the the Melbourne outbreak.
Melbourne, what were you thinking?
I know, I live and learn. And I had to self-isolate as a result of that. And here I'm in Sydney with you, Joey.
Yeah.
And we had another outbreak happening. So I think the world is trying to tell me something.
Yes. So, you know, as we are opening back up, you've been getting out and surveying some of the projects. So you've travelled quite a bit in the last little while around some of our sanctuaries. And you've actually been involved in some releases recently of some of our beautiful native rodents. We've taken to calling them stickies. Outback guinea pigs didn't catch on, but stick nest rats, which were part of a reintroduction to Mallee Cliffs National Park. This is under our groundbreaking program with the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service under their Saving Our Species program. And Tim, you were actually on site at Mallee Cliffs releasing these animals. What was that like?
It was profound, I think. And the context is that I think, just touching on COVID, that despite the impacts of COVID, we actually completed the construction and feral-free status of the Mallee Cliffs fenced area. So 9,500 hectares, largest fenced area in the Southern Hemisphere. That was achieved despite the impacts and challenges of COVID. And then we took our board, the AWC board came with us out to Mallee Cliffs. It was the first time the board had been able to get together and get on sanctuary post-COVID. So it was a really special experience to get out there and release the greatest stick nest rat, which really, they can't persist with the impact of cats and foxes in the landscape and mismanaged fire. And yeah, the greatest stick nest rat, the worst name going for a little animal, but the sticky, they're a very, very cute little animal, native rodent. And we're able to go out there and release these animals back into the landscape. And look, to be frank, I consider myself as a true, typical Australian bloke. But to go out there and participate in an activity where you're taking these little animals that, through no fault of their own, are now getting back out into the landscape, it is nothing short of inspiring to what it means at a personal level, that I've got a part to play in that activity, but also what it means for Australia. Yeah, this is our biodiversity. This is our national identity. This is what it means to be Australian, to have these species that can't be found anywhere else on the planet. And to have a part to play in making that happen. And everybody that's a part of this webinar today, and everybody that's part of the greater AWC family, you all have a part to play in this. And it's just such a magnificent thing that we're able to do with everybody's support and everybody's participation in this work. It's great.
Yeah, it's quite touching. Yeah, and I think that the reintroductions are such a tangible outcome of the work that we do, watching populations recover and repopulate areas where they've been extinct, in many cases for decades or over a century. So we're scaling up that work with these fenced havens. And one of the newer projects is specifically to look after the northern bettong. We've talked about it on the webinars previously. And you've been up to that site recently to check out progress on that.
That's right.
Project.
And this is another project that's very close to my heart. So here's a little animal, the northern bettong, that, through, again, no fault of its own, has contracted two small populations. There's somewhere in the order of 1,000 to 1,100 of these animals left in the wild. And ultimately, the current management technique for these animals, by those who should know better, is to monitor these animals. So it's another classic example of monitoring something into extinction. We're well placed and best placed at AWC to prevent that from happening, to stop it happening. And so I had the pleasure of getting up to Mount Zero Tarabal. And for those, a number of our supporters have been to Mount Zero over the years, and we've held events out there. And you'll have seen the restoration program that we've been undertaking in anticipation of bringing the northern bettong back to Mount Zero Tarabal. And so I went out and looked at the planned fenced area, and I spent time on the ground with our staff, Josh McAllister and Felicity Hatelia. We went and looked around the fenced area, and it is a significant project. It's our first project of this type in Northern Australia. And again, for those who have been to Mount Zero Tarabal would appreciate the topography and how rugged it is, and would appreciate the engineering challenges that goes into it. But yeah, one of my personal values, and what I like to think one of the values of AWC, is get stuff done. And this is going to be an example of get stuff done. And if we can get this done at Mount Zero Tarabal, and we will, we can then replicate that into similar situations across Northern Australia.
Really exciting. And that's literally an intervention that will prevent that species from going extinct. It will be the only secure population of the northern bettong in a feral predator-free area. So very exciting. I wanted to come back to Buller River briefly because we were both up there actually a couple of years ago in 2019, and then again about a month ago, and the landscape there has changed substantially. Do you want to describe what you saw on the ground at Buller River
Sure.
and where we've got to with that project?
So that's right. We spent a bit of time there in 2019, and admittedly on the back of a couple of failed wet seasons. So the Northern Australia had 2 years of failed wet seasons, but we had buffalo around, we had cattle where they shouldn't be, feral pigs. We're only just starting the fire program, and they were there, a month or 2 months ago. Spent another bit of time, and the difference was nothing short of profound. To see, and we actually had the pleasure of being there when the fire program was underway, but to see this really well delivered and well managed fire program in place, to see how cattle have been kept out of the sensitive wetlands in particular, the exclusion of how we pulled buffalo out of the property and control of feral pigs and weed management. It was really quite profound. And I think we've all chatted those that were there a couple of years ago to where we are today. It has been nothing short of profound. And a big thanks goes out to the owners of Buller River Station, Julian and Alexandra Bird, that wanted us to be there to help deliver this work. So it has been a spectacular success to date, and we are only quite early into that piece.
Yeah, really exciting project. And I think what I'd really like to talk about now is just that kind of template. So a partnership in that case with a commercial cattle station. So there's still cattle production going on at Buller River Station. And that's something completely new for AWC to be involved with, but also quite new for conservation in Australia. So I'd like to hear how you think that could be rolled out more broadly and where we're at with establishing further partnerships like that.
Sure. So I think it's a great point to make, that Buller is a commercial cattle operation. They are growing cows to sell for a profitable business. So it's a great opportunity to demonstrate how conservation outcomes can be managed and delivered alongside of commercial cattle outcomes, that they can run a business at the same time. And we are achieving those outcomes. So not only what we've just talked about, but what we're finding through the biodiversity surveys is excellent. The mammals and the reptiles and the bird species, we're achieving some great outcomes. As a result of that, I'm starting to get approaches and inquiries from other pastoralists on whether we would like to work with them on their land. And these are calls that are coming from, quite dyed-in-the-wool cow farmers that, they're very much about growing their cows, but they've recognised that there is an intrinsic value to the conservation and ecological values on their property. And if we can find a way for those to coexist, then that's a great outcome. But I think it's important probably to step back and just think about this at a continental scale or at a national level, that those who have followed AWC for some time will hear us talk about at our presentations that despite that global biodiversity hotspot that we have in Australia, we have this track record of wrecking it, to be frank, and that our biodiversity is not improving. We have more species heading towards the brink of extinction. We have more species being added to the list. And so where we are today is we really need to start to unlock how we deliver conservation at true scale, that we need to be able to implement the programs that we're doing on the AWC estate and with our partners. We need to think, how do we apply that right across the continent? And there's really a few ways of doing it. One is working with national parks and the public estate across Australia, and that's what we're doing in Pilliga and Malaclys in New South Wales. It's demonstrating that this effective conservation model can be employed on a national park. Working with Indigenous partners, and we know that there's about 75 million hectares of land managed under the Indigenous Protected Area Network, for example. So how can we work with our Indigenous partners on effective conservation? And then pastoralism and private land holdings. Pastoralism covers some 51% of the Australian landmass. So we need to figure out how can we unlock mechanisms and models where conservation and commercial cattle production coexist. And we're having a chat to landholders now where they have bilbies in their cow paddocks. And that's a really interesting and a really cool thing, that what are the mechanisms that's enabling bilbies to be in the cow paddocks? how do we understand what's happening with those processes, and how might we replicate that? So if we can develop and understand that model, we can replicate that at a continental scale.
I think that's really exciting, just thinking about how we could scale up this work that we've done across, landscapes from North Queensland to Central Australia to the Kimberley, Southwest, but across an even bigger area to improve ecological outcomes. I just want to remind everyone that you can ask questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll come to some of those questions shortly, but Tim, you've also been looking at other potential projects around Australia, and I know you were in Queensland recently. Are there any threatened species up there that you're especially interested in? Not to put too much point on it.
Not to ask too much of a leading question, Joey. But yeah, so we're having some preliminary discussions with the Queensland government on how we might be able to help with securing the future of the northern hairy-nosed wombat. And to put that into context, there's 3 species of wombats in Australia. There's the common wombat, the southern hairy-nosed wombat, and the northern hairy-nosed wombat. Many people would be familiar with the common wombat. If you live in Victoria, South Australia, you'd be familiar with the common wombat. The southern hairy-nosed wombat tends to be more South Australian orientated. But the northern hairy-nosed wombat, the traditional range, or the historic range rather, was from about Roma in central Queensland down to Deniliquin in southern New South Wales. Unfortunately, they've contracted to a very small population. There's only about 300 to 330 of these animals left, protected in 2 areas with the Epping State Forest in central Queensland and a very small reserve called the Richard Underwood Reserve in southern Queensland. So we're just exploring an opportunity on how we can work with Queensland to help secure the future. Yeah, when you've got an animal as iconic as the wombat, and particularly the northern hairy-nosed wombat, where there's only 300 of them left, to me, that's like the Kangaroo Island project, where we intervene very quickly to help secure the future of the Kangaroo Island gunnart. But if we can do the same, if we can apply that same methodology and thinking and agility to secure the future of the wombat, that's a great thing for Australia.
Really exciting. I'm also interested in the planning that is being done now to take into account things like climate change on the future of some of our projects. So I know we've been doing a lot of strategy work looking at, well, we had last week's webinar about the genetics of populations and how planning for healthy, genetically resilient populations will secure them in the longer term. But there's also work being done on climate change strategy and how to make populations and landscapes resilient to those changes that are coming. Can you tell us a bit about that work?
Sure. I think, and again, just setting the context for this little conversation is recognising that the very core of the work we do at AWC really does mitigate the impact of climate change. If you think about, if we use the bilby as that example of an ecological engineer, where the bilby's back in the landscape, they're turning over 5 tons of soil, getting leaf litter back into the ground, that's restoring the landscape, improving the health of the landscape. Those types of actions, our very actions on a day-to-day basis, help mitigate the impact of the climate change. We've also measured what our carbon emissions are. We emit somewhere around 2,000 tonnes of carbon. And that's primarily through transport, so fuel for vehicles and so on. But we abate somewhere in the order of 100,000 tonnes of carbon. And primarily that's measured through our prescribed burning program, particularly in North, our Savannah burning. Beyond that, we really now need to start thinking about what is the impact of climate change on our program. So what is the impact of climate change on our existing programs? And what is the impact of climate change on our future programs? How do we think about those impacts? We've got species in some locations that maybe in 10 to 15, 20, 25 years, that location may not be suitable habitat. So how do we think about future projects in other locations? Might be wetter, cooler, whatever the case may be. So we're starting to think through and build a strategy now. And in fact, Jen Pearson that you talked to last week, she's going to be working on our climate change strategy, and they'll be working internally and then consulting externally to think about what the impact of climate change is on our current work and on our future work.
Great. That's really cool to see that forward-looking strategy work being put into place. We might have had a little audio issue there, so I apologise if anyone missed out on any of those questions, but I think it's all good now. So Tim, we might come to some questions now, if that's okay. So I know a lot of people have sent in questions during this session, and you can still add questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We've also got some that people sent in as they registered. So I think this is a great one to kick off with, Tim. What will AWC look like in 50 years?
What will AWC look like in 50 years? That's
it's a big question.
It's a big question. But I think, look, I tend to, the way I tend to operate, the way I tend to think is, I think about Australia and where we are from a conservation point of view. Then I think about what role AWC's got in securing the future of conservation in Australia. That's how I tend to think. Start broad level and then start to break that down into what can we actually do about it. So I'd like to think that in 50 years, we've got a very engaged population, that we've got Joey, or a version of Joey, who's the next David Attenborough, that is really helping to provide a narrative of what's happening with conservation in Australia, or the future of conservation, that we've developed some pretty cool models on partnering with people that are easily replicable and can be rolled out right across the country, that we're helping to influence great conservation outcomes at a global level. And we're already starting to do a little bit of that, and we've got some of our science staff are being asked to present and meet people internationally to talk about the scale of our work. I'd like to think that the financing solution, and I think there's a big opportunity around innovative finance or alternative finance for conservation, that we've really figured out ways that we can have institutional finance being released and applied and invested, to be frank, in conservation outcomes. I'd like to think that, and this is a bit of a soapbox moment, Joe, so you need to bear with me. I'd like to think that regulation and legislation for conservation in Australia has changed. It is a fundamental issue where the concept of conservation is considered to be a government institution. And I think that at a fundamental level, that component needs to change. There needs to be a greater recognition on the contribution and the value of private land conservation. So not just AWC, but others that are doing it right across Australia. The value of private conservation, the value of work by AWC is recognised by government, and that when we're out there doing work, we're governed by a set of standards, not by government regulations. It's governed by a set of independent standards. If we can enable that, if we can get us to that point, then we're going to achieve great things for conservation in Australia.
That's a pretty strong vision, I think, for where AWC could be in 50 years. We can only do it with your help, of course. So thank you to everyone who supports AWC, because we couldn't do any of this work without you. If you're inspired to make a donation, you can do so at our website, australianwildlife.org. And at the moment, we've still got our $3 million matching challenge running. And that means that for eligible donations, the impact of your gift will be increased. So details for that can be found on our website, australianwildlife.org. Let's come to some other questions here, Tim. One is about our partnerships with Indigenous Australians, First Nations groups, and just about the opportunity there for two-way learning.
I think that's a fundamental piece of when we do these partnerships. So the partnership they are true partnerships. They're not AWC trying to take over and manage land. In fact, when I think of the Damba-Minyari partnership, that was really the genesis of that came about partly on how well we worked together on the Yampi project in the Northwest Kimberley, north of Derby, but also that they were being approached to have some of their native title land taken up for a national park, and a national park extinguishes native title rights. So Damba-Minyari and AWC were able to come together to make sure that they retained their full native title rights. We've worked with them on country, so we're learning from them. We're going out with their rangers and their traditional owners, and they're learning from us at the same time. And so we're providing training on the management of cameras, camera trap image processing and so on. And through our fire management program, and we're learning from their knowledge and their programs, both contemporary and traditional.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got a few questions about collaborations with other conservation groups. So how we're working with other national non-government groups to get better outcomes. Sure,
and I think there's day-to-day practical examples of that with Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife, where very quickly we got together and generated that Kangaroo Island Western River Refuge project. Outside of that, it is really important that conservation starts to collaborate in Australia, and I think we've got to move away from conservationists, to be frank, we've had a history of getting together in a room and we yell at each other about what's going wrong. What we've got to do is to start to build collaborations and partnerships right across the Australian industry sector. But to do that, we've formed what's called the Australian Land Conservation Alliance. And that's an alliance of AWC, Bush Heritage, the Nature Conservancy, Greening Australia, Landcare, Nature Foundation South Australia, Queensland Trust for Nature and Victorian Trust for Nature. And we get together on a quarterly basis. I'm a director of ALCA. We get together on a quarterly basis with a vision of increasing and getting the government, but also getting the community to understand the value of private conservation.
Really important work. I think, like we talked about with the bushfires, you get so much more done if you do pull together.
That's right.
So that's really a key aspect of conservation in Australia now. The ephemeral question here about when we'll buy a property in Victoria or establish a project in Tasmania.
Sure. So for those who don't know, I'm originally from Victoria. In fact, my dad lives just outside Mallacoota and my mum lives a bit further down the road. So I've got a very soft spot to doing something in Victoria. And there's parts of Victoria where you can almost see Tasmania. So the idea is if we can get something in Tasmania, that's getting close to Tasmania.
Filtered bird.
But the challenge in Victoria for the AWC model is scale, ultimately. That AWC's model is about influencing and delivering conservation programs at scale. And that's nothing all about property that typically is a large scale. And it's difficult to find those properties in Victoria. Most of the large scale property is within the national park estate. So it's quite likely that projects might include some form of partnership with others. I think that to deliver what we need to do. We are having discussions with various groups in Victoria through Gippsland and elsewhere about how we might be able to help them. And again, it's not about AWC turning up to be big and bold and take over. It's about, as you said before, how can we collaborate and where can we assist in delivering great conservation outcomes.
This year, a little later this year, we'll be celebrating 30 years since the first property was acquired by Martin Copley. What do you think is the greatest legacy of AWC to date, or our proudest achievement in your eyes?
That's a very difficult question, actually. It's I'm perpetually humbled by Martin's legacy in his vision and what he set up. I'm humbled by the fact that I've got a part to play in continuing that legacy, and I feel very privileged to be a part of it. But I think it's the people is what makes it. The opportunity that I get to work with people like yourself, Joseph, but people right across Australia, from those that work in the back office functions of the organisation to the dedication of the field ecologists, our land managers, to our supporter group who steadfastly remain committed to us over time, that we're building and creating and managing an organisation that inspires the type of loyalty, commitment and dedication that delivers great outcomes. To me, that's the biggest thing that I'm proud of AWC's years.
Yeah, the people that's definitely and all of you watching are also part of the AWC family. So thank you for your support. I think we might leave it there, Tim, but thank you for an excellent conversation. It's been great to hear about all that AWC's achieved over the last couple of years, but also some of that vision going forward, because I think we're at a tipping point now where we really can leverage some major change in how conservation happens.
The opportunities there right now, we've got the resources, the skills and the knowledge. We know what those conservation threats are, what those blockers are. We can now do something about it. We've got the opportunity to do it at vast scale. We've got the opportunity to apply innovative technology and innovative solutions to how we do this. And with your support, we're going to do it.
Thanks very much, Tim. If you've been inspired by Tim's talk today, please log on to our website, australianwildlife.org, where you can find out more about all of our programs. There you can also access our most recent newsletter magazine, Wildlife Matters, and you can download a copy. Please share this too with your family. So we'd love to get more people watching, more people engaged, and more people supporting AWC. I'll leave it there, but Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joey.
And next week, I'll talk to you all about our surveys that have been going on in the Kimberley. I'll be joined by a couple of the ecologists on the team up there, and they've made some really fantastic discoveries over the last few months of surveys. thanks everyone for tuning in. I'll see you next week.